The electric chair at the South Carolina State Penitentiary weighed several hundred pounds. On the morning of June 16, 1944, the officers who prepared it for use faced an unexpected problem. The boy they were about to execute was too small for the chair. He weighed 90 pounds. He was 5 feet 1 inch tall. The leather straps that bound adult prisoners did not fit his arms. The metal electrode that attached to the leg was too large for his. And the face mask, the mask placed over a prisoner's head before the current was applied, kept slipping off. So they placed a Bible under him to make him tall enough to die. His name was George Stinney Jr. He was 14 years old. And 70 years later, a judge in South Carolina would review his case and say, officially, on the record, that what happened to George Stinney was a great injustice. This is his story. In 1944, the town of Alkaloo, South Carolina, was exactly what it appeared to be from the air. A small place, divided cleanly in two. A railway track ran through the center of town. On one side lived the white families. On the other, the black families who worked at the lumber mill. The division was not accidental. It was policy. This was the American South under Jim Crow, a legal system of racial segregation that governed nearly every aspect of daily life. Where you sat on a bus, which drinking fountain you used, which school your children attended, which side of the tracks you lived on. George Stinney Jr. was born in 1929. His father, George Sr., worked at the Alkaloo lumber mill. The family lived in company housing, as most black families in the town did. Their home, their employment, their entire existence in Alkaloo was tied to the mill. George was the second oldest of 5 children. Those who knew him described a quiet boy, studious. He could make a whistle from a piece of cane. He liked to draw. His younger sister, Catherine, who would live to be 80 years old and still remember his face clearly, later called him smart and gentle. He was in 8th grade when everything changed. March 23, 1944, late afternoon. 2 young girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, set off on their bicycles. They were looking for maypops, a local wildflower that grew near the ditches on the edge of town. They asked a boy they passed if he knew where to find them. That boy was George Stinney. He and his younger sister Amy were watching the family's cow graze near the road. He told the girls he thought he had seen some flowers nearby. They smiled and cycled on. Neither girl came home that evening. By nightfall, both families were alarmed. A search party formed. Neighbors, mill workers, anyone willing. George Stinney joined it. During the search, he mentioned to someone nearby that he had spoken to the girls earlier in the day. He had seen them. He told them where to look for flowers. He thought this was helpful information. The following morning, March 24, 1944, the girls' bodies were found in a water-filled ditch less than a mile from the Stinney home. Both had suffered severe injuries to their heads. The town of Alkaloo did not wait long to decide who was responsible. George had been seen speaking to the girls. He was black. They were white. In Alkaloo, in 1944, that was a sufficient combination to produce a suspect. That same morning, before his parents returned home, police came to the Stinney house and took George. He was 14 years old. He did not have a lawyer present. He did not have his parents present. He was alone with uniformed officers in a small interrogation room. What happened in that room would determine everything. The interrogation of George Stinney Jr. was never recorded. There was no stenographer present. No written notes were taken that survive. No signed statement was ever produced. What we know is what the sheriff, J.H. Newman, later testified: that George had confessed to the murders. That is all we know. There is no document, no physical evidence linking George to the crime, no murder weapon bearing his fingerprints, no blood on his clothing, nothing tying him to that ditch except the word of the officers who interrogated him. 70 years later, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case would describe what almost certainly happened in that room. George Stinney was a 14-year-old black boy in a segregated South Carolina town, alone with white, uniformed officers of the law, in a system where those officers held total authority over his family's livelihood, their safety, and their place in that town. The psychologist said that under those conditions, the pressure to say whatever the officers wanted to hear would have been, in her words, overwhelming. George's sister Amy, who had been standing next to him when they spoke to the girls, would later testify that he had been with her the entire afternoon. He could not have followed the girls. He could not have been at that ditch. Nobody asked her in 1944. Within hours of his arrest, George Stinney had been charged with murder. When word spread through Alcaloo that a black boy had been charged with the murders of 2 white girls, the response was swift. George Sr. was fired from his job at the lumber mill that same day. The family lost their company housing. They lost their income. And then, 2 days after George's arrest, a white mob came for them. The family fled Alcaloo in the night. They left behind everything: their home, their possessions, their life. And they left behind George, because George could not leave. George had already been moved to a jail in a different county, far enough away that the mob could not reach him. The system that had taken their son had also, in a grim irony, protected him from the mob. For now. The trial of George Stinney Jr. took place in April 1944. It lasted less than 3 hours. His court-appointed defense attorney was a man named Charles Plowden, a tax lawyer with political ambitions and no experience in capital cases. He met with George briefly before trial. He called no witnesses in George's defense. He presented no evidence. He did not appeal the verdict. The courthouse was segregated. African Americans were not permitted inside. George's family, the people who knew him, who could speak to his character, who knew where he had been that afternoon, stood outside, unable to enter. The jury was all white. The prosecution presented one piece of evidence: the sheriff's testimony about George's alleged confession. No written confession, no murder weapon, no physical evidence of any kind. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death by electrocution. George had 83 days between the discovery of the bodies and his execution. 83 days from the afternoon he spoke to 2 girls about wildflowers, to the morning they walked him into the death chamber. During those 83 days, Governor Olin Johnston received petitions for clemency from church groups, union organizations, and civil rights advocates across the country. He ignored every one of them. June 16, 1944, 7:30 in the morning. George Stinney Jr. walked into the death chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. He was wearing a loose-fitting prison jumpsuit. Under his arm, he carried a Bible. He was 90 pounds, 5 feet 1 inch tall. The Bible he carried was also his booster seat. Officers strapped him into the electric chair. The straps were sized for adult prisoners. They did not fit correctly. The leg electrode was too large. When the executioner tried to place the metal face mask over his head, standard procedure, to obscure the prisoner's face during electrocution, it would not stay. George Stinney was too small. The mask kept slipping. When the current was applied, the mask fell away. His cellmate, a man named Wilford Hunter, later issued a statement. He said that George had denied the murders to him, quietly, every single day during the weeks before his execution. He said George had told him he didn't do it. He was 14 years old. For decades, the case of George Stinney Jr. was simply closed. A conviction, an execution, a file in an archive. But the questions never went away. Where was the murder weapon? It was never found. Where was the written confession? It never existed. Where was the physical evidence? There was none. And where was Amy, George's younger sister, who had been standing beside him when he spoke to the girls? She had been there the entire time. She had watched her brother cycle through the justice system of the American South in 83 days. And no one, not the police, not the prosecutor, not the defense attorney, had ever asked her what she saw. What she saw was her brother, standing with her, watching their family's cow, at the time the girls were attacked. He had an alibi, a witness who had been present the entire time. Nobody called her. For 70 years, Amy carried that knowledge. The movement to reopen George Stinney's case built slowly over years and finally reached a courtroom in January 2014, 70 years after his execution. A two-day hearing was held. George's surviving siblings testified. His sister Amy, now in her 80s, told the court what she had seen on the afternoon of March 23, 1944. A forensic psychologist explained the documented science of false confessions under coercive interrogation. Legal experts outlined the constitutional violations: no attorney during questioning, no impartial jury, no physical evidence, no witnesses called by the defense. On December 18, 2014, Judge Carmen Mullen delivered her ruling. She vacated George Stinney Jr.'s conviction. In her ruling, she said, "I don't have a murder weapon. I don't have bloody clothes. I don't have a written confession. I have nothing." She found fundamental violations of due process. She found that his constitutional rights had been denied at every stage. She called it a great injustice. George Stinney Jr. was 14 years old when the state of South Carolina decided he would die. He was given no lawyer who cared, no jury that looked like him, no opportunity to call a single witness. No written evidence of his guilt was ever produced. Not then, not ever. He was black. The victims were white. The year was 1944. In Alcaloo, South Carolina, that was the entire case. His sister Catherine, who was 80 years old when the conviction was finally vacated, said this: "I can still see his little face. He had the potential to be great. He was 14. South Carolina executed him anyway. And it took 70 years, a two-day hearing, 3 surviving siblings, and a judge with enough honesty to say what had been obvious since 1944. That what they did to George Stinney was wrong. That it had always been wrong." If this story stayed with you, it should. George Stinney's case is not a historical anomaly. It is a documented pattern. Wrongful convictions happen in every country, in every era, to people who cannot fight back against the systems that were supposed to protect them. If you want to see more cases like this one, stories that deserve to be told and remembered, subscribe to this channel. Every video we publish covers a real case the world has largely forgotten. George Stinney Jr. deserves to be remembered.